The young constable's voice had that particular edge to it, the kind that comes not from experience, but from a badge that's still stiff and new. "Sir, this section of the terminal is restricted. Canadian Border Services operations only. You'll need to turn around." He was maybe 26, Constable André Pelletier, with the crisp uniform and the squared shoulders of a man who had graduated top of his intake class and hadn't yet been wrong about anything important. He stood in the lower corridor of Vancouver International Airport's International Arrivals Wing, arms crossed, blocking a man who had no business being there. The man he was blocking looked like he'd driven in from somewhere north of Kamloops. His jacket was one of those old Stanfield wool shirts in faded green, the kind that had been washed so many times it had given up any ambition of holding its shape. His trousers were work pants, not the decorative kind people buy at outdoor stores, but actual work pants with actual stains ground into the knee fabric that no laundry cycle would ever fully remove. He carried a single bag, a canvas duffel, army green, one of the old pattern ones with the brass buckles that hadn't been standard issue since before Pelletier was born. His hair was white at the temples, thick still, combed back without any particular vanity. He was somewhere past 65, though the number felt approximate, the way age becomes approximate in men who've spent their lives outdoors. His name was Hector Dawes, though Pelletier didn't know that yet. He had stopped walking when Pelletier stepped into his path, and he hadn't looked startled, or confused, or apologetic. He had simply stopped, the way a man stops when he encounters a closed gate he expected to be open. Patient, evaluating. His eyes, gray, pale, the color of Lake Superior in November, moved from Pelletier's face to the corridor behind him, where 8 dogs and their handlers were staged for transfer. They were RCMP police dog service animals, specifically 8 Belgian Malinois from the National Breeding Program, currently being transferred from the Pacific Region Training Facility to a joint task force deployment in Toronto. The handlers were a mix of seasoned constables and one supervisor, Sergeant Colette Varga, who had 12 years in the service and had seen every kind of disruption a K9 transfer could produce. She had not seen this. "I think Gate C12 is just back through the main hall," Pelletier continued, his voice acquiring a faint instructive quality, the tone used on elderly tourists. "I can call someone to walk you if you need." "I'm fine," the old man said. His voice was low, not quiet in the way of someone being polite, but quiet the way a river is quiet, the sound of something very large moving with controlled energy. "Gate C12 isn't my gate. I'm on AC 189 to Halifax. Boards in 40 minutes. That's still not this corridor, sir." The old man gave a slow nod. He didn't argue. He also didn't leave. His gaze had settled on the dogs. It happened gradually at first, the way weather changes in the mountains, subtle shifts that only mean something if you know what to look for. The nearest Malinois, a 3-year-old male designated Kodiak and handled by a young constable named Burke, went from a relaxed stand to a rigid, trembling attention. Not aggressive attention, something more complex. Kodiak's nostrils worked rapidly, his head lifting and dropping in short, precise movements, triangulating the source of something his training had never fully prepared him for. Then the animal next to Kodiak, a female named Sable, made a sound. It was barely a sound, more of a vibration, a low resonance that started somewhere deep in her chest and traveled out through her partly open mouth. Burke glanced at her, then back at Kodiak, and the small furrow between his eyebrows deepened. "Hey," Burke said softly to Kodiak. "Easy. Settle." Kodiak did not settle. Within 90 seconds, all 8 dogs were in a state that their handlers had no protocol for. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't fear. The dogs weren't barking or straining toward the old man. They were oriented on him the way a compass orients on north. Completely, helplessly, as though they lacked the biological capacity to look anywhere else. 3 of them had shifted their weight onto their haunches in something approaching a formal sit without being commanded to do so. The handlers were issuing corrections that the animals weren't registering at all, not because they were defying the commands, but because the commands weren't reaching them. Something older and more fundamental had taken over their attention entirely. Pelletier heard the shift behind him and turned. His composure cracked slightly. "What's happening with them?" "They're not used to unexpected contact in staging," Sergeant Varga said from the side of the corridor, but her voice was distracted, because she was already watching the old man with an expression that wasn't quite concern and wasn't quite recognition. It was something between the two. Pelletier turned back to Hector Dawes. The old man hadn't moved, hadn't changed his posture, hadn't made any gesture toward the animals. He was simply standing there, watching them with an expression of calm attention that Pelletier found, for reasons he couldn't articulate, more unsettling than any amount of visible agitation would have been. "Sir, you're disturbing the animals. I need you to leave the area immediately." Hector Dawes looked at Pelletier, not through him, not over his shoulder, directly at him, with the full weight of those gray eyes. It lasted only a second, but Pelletier felt in some animal part of himself the involuntary urge to take a step back. "They're not disturbed," Hector said simply. "They're confused. There's a difference. With all respect, sir, I know you don't handle them," Hector said. It wasn't unkind. It was a statement of fact the way the time of day is a statement of fact. The handlers do, and they're confused too. He nodded toward Burke, who was kneeling beside Kodiak now, his hands on the dog's shoulders, speaking in urgent low tones that Kodiak continued to thoroughly ignore. Pelletier's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being corrected by an old man in a wool shirt. Sergeant Varga had been watching Hector Dawes for almost 3 minutes now. She was a methodical person by nature, the daughter of a surveyor, trained from childhood to take accurate measurements before drawing conclusions. What she was measuring now didn't have a name in any manual she'd read, but it was producing readings she couldn't dismiss. The man's hands first. He was holding the duffel strap in his right hand, and his grip was what her father would have called a working grip. Not decorative, not tense, but the grip of a hand that had held hundreds of different things under hundreds of different conditions and knew by reflex how much pressure was required. The knuckles of that hand were mapped with old scars. Not accident scars. A person accumulates accident scars on their palms and fingertips. These were on the back of the hand and across the base of the thumb. She had seen that pattern before in handlers who'd worked with young, untrained animals during their early formation period. His posture, second. The Stanfield jacket and the work pants created a deliberate visual impression of a man who occupied very little space in the world, and in motion he probably carried it off. But standing still, in the way he was standing still right now, the impression dissolved. His weight was centered and low. His shoulders had an alignment that had nothing to do with age. It was the alignment of a body that had been trained over many years to be completely ready from a standing position. Not tense, ready. The distinction was significant and almost impossible to fake. His eyes, third and most telling. He wasn't looking at the dogs the way civilians looked at dogs, as a collection of interesting or alarming behavior to be observed from a comfortable distance. He was tracking each animal with the rapid, efficient processing of someone running constant assessments. Ear angle, weight shift, respiratory rate, the particular quality of the attention each dog was directing at him. He was reading all of it simultaneously, and behind the calm surface of his face, she could see him integrating the information, drawing conclusions, preparing a response. He already knew what was happening. He had known before any of the handlers did. He was simply waiting for the right moment to address it. The moment arrived when Kodiak began to pace. It was contained pacing, 3 steps forward and 3 steps back in the confines of the lead, but it broke the dam. 2 other dogs immediately took up the same rhythm, and within seconds the staging area had devolved into a scene that was, by any operational standard, a mess. 8 highly trained animals cycling between agitation and a desperate, searching attention. 8 handlers using every tool in their kit to zero effect. Voices overlapping, leash pressure applied and released, names called, and the dogs, every one of them, continuing to pour every bit of their focus into the still, quiet figure of one old man 20 feet away. Pelletier turned on Hector, and there was genuine anger in his face now, the anger of a young man who has watched a situation deteriorate and found someone to assign it to. "I don't know what you're doing or how you're doing it, but you're interfering with a federal operation. I'm going to ask you one more time, and after that I'm going to Pelletier." Sergeant Varga's voice was not loud, but it stopped him. She walked forward, past Pelletier, past the struggling handlers, and stopped at a respectful distance from Hector Dawes. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then, in the measured tone of a person who has just finished a long calculation and trusts the result, "You worked with the foundational lines." It wasn't a question. Hector Dawes looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not much, the way tectonic plates don't shift much when they move, but the effect is significant. He held her gaze for a moment, then let it move back to the dogs. Long time ago, he said. You're producing a signature they recognize, Varga said carefully. Not you personally. The pattern. The conditioning architecture from the source bloodlines, the early protocol. They're getting a signal from you that their training was built on top of, and their handlers aren't producing it, so they don't know how to reconcile what they're sensing. Pelletier stared at his sergeant. What does that mean? She ignored him, keeping her eyes on Hector. Can you resolve it? The old man was quiet for a moment. He set his duffel down on the floor beside him, the motion slow and deliberate. He rolled his right shoulder once, less a stretch than a preparation. Then he walked forward, not fast, not slow, with exactly the number of steps required to place himself at the center point of the corridor, equidistant from the animals on either side. The handlers instinctively moved back half a step, not because they'd been told to, but because something about the shift in the old man's presence created space around him, the way a change in air pressure creates space before a storm. Pelletier would not be able to describe it properly afterward, not in his report, not to his family over dinner, not to his training officer when the incident was reviewed. The old man hadn't done anything dramatic. He hadn't raised his arms or assumed a commanding stance or projected his voice. He'd simply changed. The soft-shouldered, weathered figure that had looked, 10 minutes ago, like a retired schoolteacher from the interior, that figure had, without theatrical gesture or obvious effort, become something else. The space he occupied felt larger. The air felt more attentive. His eyes moved across the dogs, one by one, with the systematic thoroughness of a review, and each animal, as his gaze reached it, went still. Then he spoke. It was 2 syllables. Not English, not French, not any language Pelletier could identify. Something older, rougher at the edges, with the weight of a word that had been used for a purpose so many times it had absorbed the purpose into itself. He didn't project the word. He barely voiced it, but in the sudden relative quiet of the corridor, it reached every animal with perfect clarity. Calmez. Not the French word, or not only. Something older, running underneath it like a river under ice. A word from the deep vocabulary of the early training lines, the foundational protocol from the national program's first generation, before the methodology had been documented and standardized and turned into manuals. A word that didn't just instruct behavior. A word that addressed the animal's internal state directly. That said, in the language of conditioning laid down before conscious memory, that the alarm could stop, that the search was over, that whatever authority their deepest instincts had been seeking was here, present, acknowledged. All 8 dogs lay down, not sequentially, not in a ripple, simultaneously as if a current had been switched off. 8 animals going from cycling, restless agitation to a complete, settled stillness in the same instant. The sound of paws on tile, of handlers' voices, of leash hardware shifting. It stopped. The corridor was silent. 8 heads rested on 8 pairs of paws, and 8 pairs of eyes looked at Hector Dawes with an expression that was, in the vocabulary of animals, indistinguishable from peace. Burke's mouth was open. Pelletier had stopped breathing for a moment. When he remembered to start again, he found that some of the certainty had gone out of his posture, leaked away without his noticing. He looked at the old man, and then at the dogs, and then back at the old man, and the architecture of the last 10 minutes rearranged itself in his understanding in a way that was not entirely comfortable. What? He had to clear his throat. What did you say to them? Hector Dawes had already receded slightly. The presence he'd occupied the center of the corridor with was pulling back, the way water pulls back from a shoreline, and the man reappearing in its wake was just an old man again, gray at the temples, jacket worn at the elbows, showing the mild, private expression of someone who has finished a task that didn't require much comment. Told them the work was done, he said. Sergeant Varga came to stand beside him. She had her arms crossed, but it was a thoughtful posture rather than a guarded one. The original conditioning sequence, she said, from the first program, before the split into regional centers. I read about it in the archival record. There was a study of intergenerational retention in the bloodlines, whether early conditioning markers persisted across generations of breeding. The conclusion was inconclusive. She paused. The study was inconclusive. The markers apparently weren't. The markers weren't, Hector agreed, in the tone of a man confirming something he's known for a while. Pelletier was looking at his sergeant with the expression of a person who has arrived late to a conversation and is trying to catch up without asking obvious questions. What program? What conditioning sequence? Before your time, Varga said, not dismissively but with the simple accuracy of the statement. She looked at Hector. Before mine, properly. I only know what's in the written record, and I gather that's not most of it. Hector made a small sound that might have been agreement. He looked at the dogs again, with the same flicker that had crossed his face earlier, the look of a man seeing something that connects to a part of his life he doesn't often revisit. It wasn't nostalgia, exactly. Nostalgia implies warmth. This was more like recognition, the acknowledgement of a shared history that was real and significant without being simple. Burke the handler straightened from his crouch beside Kodiak and looked at the old man. His face was still registering the specific bewilderment of someone whose professional expertise has just been quietly but comprehensively exceeded. He's been working perfectly for 18 months, he said. I've never seen him do that, any of that. He did his job, Hector said. He looked at Burke with a directness that was not unkind. He was telling you something was wrong with the information he was receiving. That's what the behavior was, a report. He couldn't put it in a form you recognized. Burke absorbed this, and the word, the thing you said, gave him a reference point he understood, resolved the conflict. Hector glanced down at the dog. He's a good animal, well built, well managed. You can see it in how fast he settled. He looked back up at Burke. You've done right by him. Burke blinked. He was 29 years old and had spent the last several years learning that praise came rarely and from people who had earned the right to give it. Something in the old man's forward assessment reached a place in him that 12 months of performance reviews had not touched. He didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say, but his posture adjusted by a few degrees, taller, something more settled in the shoulders. Pelletier had been quiet for almost 2 minutes, which was unusual for him. He was replaying the last quarter hour in his head, and the playback wasn't flattering. He had looked at this particular man, standing in front of him, and processed the jacket and the duffel bag and the weathered face and arrived at a conclusion that had been wrong in every meaningful way. He had used his authority as a tool to remove something he'd assessed as a problem, and the thing he'd been trying to remove had, without raising its voice, without asserting anything, simply resolved the situation that his authority had been unable to touch. He thought about the tone he'd used, the elderly tourist tone. He thought about the word that had come naturally to his mind, obstacle, and felt something behind his sternum that he didn't have precise language for, but that had the general character of shame. Sir, he said. He didn't plan what came next. It came out before the self-consciousness could intercept it. I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about who you were, and I treated you accordingly, and I was wrong. Hector Dawes looked at him. He studied him for a moment, not evaluating whether the apology was genuine. Pelletier had the impression, but assessing something else, something he was looking for in the younger man's face. You were protecting your post, Hector said. That's what you're supposed to do. The instinct was right. Don't let the lesson make you doubt the instinct. He paused. Just keep in mind that the information you're working with at the start of any situation is usually incomplete. The job is to update as more comes in. Most people don't. They stick with the first read because changing it costs something. Pelletier nodded slowly. He was going to think about this for a while. Hector glanced at Varga. The older lines, the ones these dogs descend from, they had a broader conditioning vocabulary than what went into the regional manuals. Some of it didn't make the transfer when the documentation was standardized. Thought it had been lost. Apparently not entirely, Varga said. Apparently not. He reached down and picked up his duffel, settling the strap on his shoulder with the fluid economy of someone for whom the motion was very old. He looked at the dogs one last time, a long, private look, the kind that involves a reckoning with time. Pelletier found himself wanting to ask questions, many questions. The operational history, the program, the conditioning architecture, the word, who this man had been, what he had done, what had shaped him into someone who could walk into a corridor of elite working animals and, without effort and without announcement, be instantly recognized as the source. But he had the distinct sense that asking would be the wrong gesture, that the information the man carried was of the kind that didn't belong to the asking. It had been offered in the form of the solution and the small lesson at the end, and that was what had been offered. Varga seemed to read this in him because she spoke quietly. These men, the ones from the early formation programs, you won't find them on any active roster. When they step back, they step all the way back. They don't consult. They don't lecture. They don't write memoirs. She watched Hector walking away down the corridor. They just go live their lives. Some of them farm, some of them fish, and then end up in airports, Pelletier said. And then end up in airports, she agreed. Hector Dawes had reached the far end of the corridor. He paused at the escalator, not to look back. He didn't look back, but with the brief hesitation of a man taking a breath before the next part of his day. Then the escalator took him, and in the way of airports and crowds and the general indifference of large public spaces to the people moving through them, he became simply a man with a duffel bag and a flight to catch, absorbed back into the river of travelers until he was indistinguishable from any of them. He was flying to Halifax. His granddaughter was starting her first semester at Dalhousie in the fall, and they had 3 weeks before then to spend on the property he'd owned for the last 20 years in Lunenburg County, 12 acres on the south shore with a woodlot and a small boat he used when the weather allowed. She had her grandfather's eyes, pale and specific, the kind that registered things before they needed to be mentioned. He'd noticed it in her when she was very small, and it had made him feel something he didn't name, because he was a man who named very few of his feelings, preferring to let them inform his actions and leave it at that. The corridor was quiet. The dogs were resting. Burke sat beside Kodiak with his hand resting on the animal's back, not issuing commands, just present, which was what the dog wanted. Pelletier stood still for a moment and looked at the space the old man had left. Not the physical space, the other kind, the dent in the air that remains briefly after something significant passes through it. "How do you know all that?" he said to Varga. "About the programs. My uncle worked for the national program," she said. "Second generation. He used to say that the things they built into those first animals, the real things, the deep architecture, were so thoroughly done that they'd probably outlast the institutional memory of everyone who built them." She glanced toward the escalator. Looks like he was right. Pelletier thought about the word, the 2 syllables that had traveled the length of the corridor and put 8 highly trained animals on the floor like a hand smoothing a wrinkled cloth. He tried to reconstruct it, but it wouldn't quite come. The shape of it was there, but not the weight. Some things, he was starting to understand, couldn't be recalled. They had to be earned. He straightened his jacket, squared himself, and went back to his post.